Hello, and welcome to today's webinar titled Assessing Student Progress. I'm Tammy Serrano, IPDA's Training and Curriculum Design Facilitator. Today's facilitator is Ariel Pachokas. Ariel is the Assistant Director of the Adult Education for Collier County Public Schools. Today's webinar will focus on how adult education currently assesses students' progress. In addition, we will explore alternative strategies that can better guide instruction and identify instructional gaps. Before we get started, let's go over some housekeeping reminders. Today's webinars are already loaded on the IPDA website. Along with the PowerPoint, there's a handbook containing templates to help you get started. A recorded version of this webinar will be available in 48 hours. Right now, you're on listen-only mode. We do love to hear from you, so make sure you use the Q&A option to ask questions or for comments. We will monitor your questions throughout the presentation. Ariel, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Tammy. Hello, everyone. It's exciting to be here today, sharing about assessing student progress. I'll go and start by discussing a little bit about TABE and CASAS, and how can we use it to start our instruction and guide our instruction. We'll then transition to assessing and monitoring student learning using formative assessments and what those mean, and without getting too complex. I'll then highlight some common activities that we're all using and how we can use those to guide instruction as formative tools. And then finally, we'll close the presentation by maybe discussing some ways of providing some student feedback, what that looks like, and some real-world examples. Whenever I bring on a new instructor into adult education, I always start by sharing that one of the best parts of adult education is that we don't give grades, meaning that our students can't fail. However, one of the worst parts of adult education is that we don't give grades. And so our students really never know or have a sense of where they are or how they're doing. Instead, we say things like, great, you scored a 191. Or you're at an NRS 4, which from the student's perspective means absolutely nothing at all. So instead of the goal today, take some time to help set the stage for our students of where they are in relationship to their pre-test assessments. And then as we're providing instruction, how do we tie in what we're doing in class to those gaps and help them understand where they are. So where do we start? So let's take a look at a little bit of a sample TABE assessment. So here I have a sample TABE, and it's basically identifying specific content skills that can be used to guide instruction and assess students. And we quickly can see here a partial proficiency. In this individual student profile form, we see that number operations and fractions, number operations in base 10s and expressions and of equations are an area of partial proficiency and a great place for us to start the conversation with the student and the instruction. Diving a little deeper into the same report, we get even more specific direction as to the skills that the student has demonstrated, which I've crossed out there with a big red X, that we don't have to worry about that. And instead, the areas we want to focus on highlighted in yellow. So we have gone from being overwhelmed and overwhelming the student to really having a meaningful data chat involving the student in taking ownership of their learning by identifying 1 or 2 weeks worth of review, a doable plan that can lead to some immediate gains. Along these same lines, IPDA has created some amazing set of documents called IISPs, Individualized Instructional Student Plans, that really facilitate the same conversation using a fillable PDF template that's customizable to each of your students, that naturally allows for a data conversation to occur and quickly guides them through the process. Let me pause a little bit here and pivot to our IPDA website. So bear with me a second as I take us there. So hopefully you're seeing the IPDA website. And right here on the home page, you'll notice the Adult Ed Toolbox. And within that Adult Ed Toolbox, you'll see the TABE Assistance Center. And when we go in here, you'll notice that there's amazing set of resources. And the one I'm going to focus on is here on the right-hand side, where they have the individualized instructional student plans, the IISPs. And we were just looking at a sample TABE for math, and it was a level M. And so I'm going to come down here where it says ABE math, IISP math TABE level M. And as I select that, I'm opening up a PDF document, fillable, where I can type in the student's name, the teacher he's working with, their ID number, the date we're having this conversation, mark off what test level it was. And in this case, it was a level M, form 11. So I can really be specific here. And one of the first things I see is what we were just talking about, numbers and operations and base 10. And there's a 15%. And that 15% is a high, an indicator for the instructor to help them understand that this domain only comes up on 15% of the questions. So it's not necessarily a heavily tested item. And so that kind of gauges how much time we might want to spend on it. If we dive a little deeper into these, we can see that we have emphasis levels, medium, low emphasis, high emphasis. So those are the areas we might want to spend more time on or less time on. And so this quickly gives us an indicator, or the student an indicator of what I'm going to be doing, what I need to focus on, and how much time do I want to spend on it, or with the direction of the instructor. So really a great customizable tool, easy to use, all focused around the student. As you fill this out, now we've given a copy to the student to take ownership of their own learning. And just like here, we had number and operations in base 10. If we go down a little further, we have number and operations fraction, which is now 20% of the assessment. And then if we go a little bit further, we see the other ones. So an amazing tool. So I'm going to pivot us back to our presentation. Bear with me a second. Bear with me, I just missed it. There we go. And we should be back at our PowerPoint. So we were talking about TABE and a great tool. So now let's move into CASAS really briefly. So CASAS provides us with the same or very similar style of reports, very detailed, very specific. And in this particular case, where we're now looking at a sample, we're looking at the student sample individual student performance. And this is specifically by content standards. And we can quickly see the specific content standards that we need to support or help the student with. We can focus on those areas. Typically, when I sit with a student, I'm looking at those areas that are most heavily missed, or the 50% or less. And as we're looking at that, I see those areas of interpreting words and phrases, words with multiple meanings, analyzing how the author shapes the content, along with determining implicit and explicit details. Again, we've taken a big, heavy, unknown, we don't know anything about the student, to now having some direction on who the student is and where we want to start the conversation over the next few weeks and making it accessible. So now we're moving ahead and we're actually diving into instruction, and we're working with the students in the class. And at some point along this line, we need to start talking about some formative assessments and what those are. A common assumption is that formative assessment is a test at the end of a unit. However, the reality is formative assessments should be used to monitor student learning and understanding as we're providing the instruction to the students, so that we can gauge where clarification is needed or support may be needed. We don't want to get to the end point to realize, wait a minute, my students didn't really get it. Let me start all over again. Probably the best scenario that helped me understand this was when I was going back to my elementary days of teaching. I would take my students on a field trip. And when we did that, my field trip, I always had one main objective that day. It wasn't about how much fun they would have connecting what they've been learning to the experience that they would be encountering. None of that. The main objective was that if I left with 20 students, I needed to come back with 20 students, and hopefully the same 20 students. So what did I do to ensure this? Well, before we left, I would pair my students together and do a quick head count. Once we got on the bus, I would do another head count. As we got off the bus at the field trip at the museum or the zoo, I did another head count to ensure I didn't leave anybody on the bus. When we gathered for lunch, I would do another head count. As we got back on the bus to return back to school, I do another head count. And when we returned back to school off the bus, I did my last head count, making sure I didn't forget anybody on the bus. In other words, through my lesson, I need to pause at key moments and check for understanding, a head count of sorts, to ensure that all the students are still with me, to identify who might be already falling behind before they're lost. This gives me an indicator of who I need to provide some additional support or review with on the side later on. Critical when working with adults, because typically our adults don't like to ask questions. So we need to establish different techniques to monitor our students' learning along the way, and not just wait for 7 or 8 weeks down the line when they hit the 70 hours to find out that based on the TABE or the CASAS, they didn't really make any growth. However, it doesn't have to be a multiple choice test to gauge their understanding. Oftentimes, that format doesn't really assess what is really needed or in the context that you're presenting it. Instead, the usual activities that we do, and here's a list that I threw up together very quickly. It's not exhaustive, but items that I see my teachers using in the classroom all the time that can easily be used as formative assessments if we encounter the correct key elements. What are those key elements? Well, 5 main pieces. They must be purposeful and deliberate. So whatever we're asking our students to do, they have to be with a key takeaway for them and for us as the instructor, with ongoing checkpoints to ensure that everyone is where everyone is and who needs some additional support. So it's my gauge. We need to be mindful of differentiating the ways students will interact or demonstrate their understanding. One area that I've been struggling with, that I always have conversations with our teachers, is our foundational or beginning ESOL students. How can they demonstrate their understanding when their oral communication skills might be limited? Because we can't just assume they're not getting it just because they can't produce it back to us. It needs to provide the instructor with direction of what's working and what's not, so that we can adjust instruction. This means we need to model often means we need to model the process, model the expectations of what we want, so that we can get the feedback we're looking for to ensure the students are getting it. And then also we need to use the targeted language to provide that specific feedback. Both teachers and students need to be involved in this process in identifying the learning that's going to happen. Adult learners want to know where they're going, how they're going to use this, how is this relevant to me, and at the end of the day, I think the best way that we've been able to really help our students and move this along is with the use of a rubric, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And ultimately, that rubric should tie specifically into their learning goals, what the students are ultimately, where we want the students to ultimately take their learning. Finally, we've got one last component, which we don't often talk too much about in adult education, and that's the use of self-assessments, which are a great tool, underutilized, but, and I think it's often underutilized because we don't teach it, because we need to teach students how to provide, how to reflect on their own learning, how to reflect on their peers' learning, and where they are at in between. That's the great part of working with adults. We can rely on their experiences and their expertise to provide some of that feedback, taking the work off of us. So what's an example of a formative assessment? Well, an exit ticket. That's one thing our teachers in Collier are using a lot. Oftentimes it might not be at the end of the day, but it might be in a transition from one activity to another, but they're using exit tickets. And it's a simple strategy where students respond to a question to show their understanding of a concept. Exit tickets can be implemented in any classroom, both physical or virtual. There are applications such as Poll Everywhere, Google Forms, Microsoft Forms that make exit tickets even easier as they compile the results for the teacher. Another app that I've got displayed here, which is completely free, requires that only the teacher have technology, and that might be in the form of a smartphone or a tablet, is Plickers, which allows students to answer questions by holding up a unique card. And the teachers kind of just scans the room using their device. And here we see a little sample where we can see Javier, who got it, and Catherine, who might have missed it, with a little red dot. But also provides, it sends it into a document where the teacher can then follow up later of who needs more support and who needs more help. The neat thing about this Plickers, it's really a low-tech kind of tool, providing instant feedback, low risk, as far as students feeling embarrassed by responding incorrectly. Great tool to use in a correctional setting because all they're holding up is a little paper card. So really simplistic. Again, this is just one example from the list I mentioned before that really allows for us to be able to monitor, gauge where they are at, and provide feedback to the instructor of who's getting what and what do I need to do a little differently, or what needs to be retaught. So as we continue then, we don't give grades to our students. And so our students can't ever fail, but at the same time, they never have a sense of how they're doing. So adult learners want to know about their progress. They want to know how they're doing. Our students, both in our virtual worlds and our physical classrooms, they're asking for that specific feedback from their teachers. But how do we do that without discouraging them and at the same time engaging them with purpose? Well, here we have what's called a feedback cycle. It's a straightforward concept, but one that requires a little direction, requires a measurable goal, and finally, timely feedback, specific and timely. Used correctly, very powerful tool that ultimately empowers the learner. As we use assessments, I mean, I'm using assessments really loosely. It might be a product that the teacher's asking the students to produce. It might be an activity that they're engaging in. It could be a task. And regardless of what that activity, product, assessment might be, we're going to use it to kind of drive instruction. Those assessments, activities need to be connected to some kind of measure. Because without a clear measure, a clear goal, objective, it makes evaluating really difficult. So we want to have that measure. We might know this as I mentioned earlier as a rubric. When we have that tool, a measure, now we can provide some specific and deliberate feedback based on how the student's product comes out. Well, how does that fit in the big picture? Well, once the student receives that feedback, students now see how it fits into their world, how it fits into their plan. They're able to internalize it, correct some misconceptions, correct some pronunciation errors. Maybe I'm dropping the ending of sounds, and then revise their product, their activity, their usage, ultimately revising their learning. That's the goal, improving their learning. Where I've seen this scenario, and which might be a little bit more accessible for everybody to visualize, I think in the adulthood world, a lot of us do a lot with resume writing. And so as we do resume writing, we have a clear vision of what that resume should look like. And we kind of often coach students on how to revise it, tweak it, modify some words, some usage, how to clean it up ultimately. And so that's the same process. But can we see this activity or something similar to this feedback occurring in while we're doing speaking and listening activities in an ESOL class, or perhaps an AB math problem? What would that look like? So let me jump ahead and give you another example. So here's a rubric. I'm pretty big on rubrics. It helps me focus my instruction. It helps me communicate, articulate to my students where we're going, what we're doing, why we're doing this. If I can't share this with them, we're kind of running blind. So I kind of start with a rubric. I don't intend rubrics to be done for every activity. I would drive myself nuts. I would overwhelm my students. I kind of focus on an overarching focus. And I really kind of prioritize it on what is it that my students need most. So here's an example of an ABE rubric, speaking and listening for our ESOL level 4 students. Everything in here was taken right out of the adult ESOL frameworks, copied and pasted. My target objective for my students at an ESOL level 4 is right there at that in the middle level, 3.0 level. That's what I'm shooting for. That's what I'm hoping my students are able to do. And I'm sharing this with them and helping them understand that I'm wanting them to participate in conversation with their partner. I'm wanting them to express their ideas. I'm asking them to restate what they heard from others and then ask clarifying questions. That's my goal for the next 2-3 weeks, perhaps, as we're bringing in new topics, as I'm asking them to speak and listen and share. That's what I'm looking from them to see, where do I need to help and coach them on? Why do I have a 4.0 or a 2.0? Well, the 2.0 is probably where we're starting. That's where majority of my students might be, and I want to get them to that 3.0. Why do I have a 4.0? Because my ESOL class, it's never the perfect ESOL level 4. I've got a mixture of students in there. So I know that some of my students might get there a little faster, and I'm not going to just tell them, well, stay home for the next 2 days or 3 days because you've already got this. I'm going to continue to push them up, asking them to explain more of their ideas, build on the ideas of others, add relevant information and evidence. So I'm going to ask them to build more with their language and their understanding and their usage. So that's an example of a speaking and listening. Here's one I created very quickly in our ABE NRS level 3s, right out of the framework, again, targeting at 3.0 level. Students will be able to generate equivalent fractions, compare two fractions with different numerators. That's my target. I'm going to have a goal for those that are working a little faster, and my baseline is that 2.0 of where we're starting. Very simplistic rubrics, but it gives me the opportunity to articulate to my students where we are, where we're heading, and what I'm looking for from them. So far, so good. And I'm going to pause for a second, see if there's any. And so I see a question, and I'm going to go back a little bit. How can plickers be adapted to a correctional setting? Plickers, it's easy because as long as you've given the tools and you've set it up, the students, all they need to do is hold out the card. The teacher then just scans the room with their device. Again, every correctional setting might be a little different. If you're able to bring a device in to utilize it, if your correctional setting understands that what the intent of it is, we're able to use it within our correctional setting. We work in a jail setting, so they're able to do it there. So it's a matter of just approaching it and thinking about it a little differently. So hopefully that answered that question. I'll keep moving along. And so we get into feedback now. And as we get into feedback, one of the things we've been talking about is the feedback sandwich, which all it is really a feedback embedded between the critical feedback embedded between two positive statements. So we got two buns, which is positive, and then that opportunity. Why is this important? Well, it's a great way, a great way of providing critical feedback in a very positive way that builds the students up, but at the same time is timely, it's specific, it's clear to the student, but also gives them a sense of some of your expectations. And those are those positive pieces that our students often need to hear again and again to encourage what they're already doing. That's great, but now let's take it to the next level. Let me give you an example of what one of those a sample sandwich feedback, some starters that I put together. So here's an example for an ESOL class. Great use of today's vocabulary within your response. I heard you say, and here in bold print, I heard you say text instead of text. Make sure to remember the ending sound. Thank you again for sharing and participating. So I have my positive statements that I'm in my ESOL classrooms. I'm always encouraging students to participate. I want them to participate. In this example, I don't only want them to participate, I want them to participate using the vocabulary that we're talking about and with the focus of ending sounds. The main piece I wanted this student to take away from, hey, you're dropping. Remember, focus, let's articulate all of those sounds. In the next example, we're talking more about an AB math class. Excellent work showing your steps in the problem. Helps me see your thinking process. There's my kudo, there's my positive feedback first bun. Here's my meat. Here's the main thing I want that student to focus on. I see here that you added first and then multiplied. What do you remember about the order of operations? Again, I don't need to give them the answers. I just need to guide them. And I want them to focus on that aspect. Again, nice step-by-step work. Thank you for showing me your work. I'm giving them the kudos on what expectations I have for him or the rest of the class. Very simplistic, very basic, very positive. Students feed off of this. So with that being said, let's look at a couple of examples on what this might look like in the real world. Well, here's an example of our welding instructor in our CT class over at Lorenzo Walker. The instructor asked students to submit a photo of their final product. In this particular case, it was just they were cutting a piece of steel using oxyfuels, and it was just upload a photo of your product. He has attached a rubric to it, which the students had access to prior. Their expectations for their final product, the photo, was very clear. What they needed to do, the project, what cut they needed, what tools, what equipment, what processes they needed to perform, all listed in the rubric. And bam, that's it from the teacher's perspective. They've been working on this project for a couple of weeks because they're working on new systems. And product, the student uploads the photo, our teacher reviews it, grades them. Great on these components. Here are some areas we need to focus on. But then he gives them a piece of feedback, which takes it to the next level, really personalizes it for the student. And while the rubric provides the specific components that the student needs to grow on, that feedback is, again, I have to use these words, deliberate, purposeful, and then actionable, that the student can step away and take it to the next level. In this example, we see that after watching, and I'm quoting this, the instructor, after watching you operate the oxy-fuel track burner, I am confident you have learned all the skills needed to implement this skill. Perfect, that's that first bun of the feedback sandwich. Now comes the meat. A small amount of time should be spent practicing the start of your cuts to prevent the rolled edge. So that's what he wants the students to focus on. Once that skill is mastered, I would consider you an exceptional performer. So that's that final bun, positive feedback again. Very specific, timely, purposeful, and the student knows exactly what he needs to focus on, or she, to continue to improve their skill in this particular example. Here's another example from one of our high intermediate classes. And again, we're doing quite a bit with Canvas and Collier. So we're asking our students to upload there, but I think the examples can be transferable anywhere. And in this particular case, the instructor has provided the students with the task of introducing themselves using a PowerPoint. The feedback in this case is, again, very specific and actionable from the student's perspective. And we've got Whitney doing a shout out to the student. Love your presentation, Miriam. Hope you will share with us in class. So there's that positive piece, loved it. Here's the key, the specific and actionable step. I would love to hear more about your interest in books. Tell me more, elaborate. That's what the main focus she's asking them to be able to produce and add to. And then she finally wraps it up with with that last positive bun, the bun on the bottom. How interesting. Now, one of the things, and one of the things that Canvas allows us to do, and I'm going to pivot a little bit just because it's an opportunity here, is there's a little, hard to see perhaps, but on the bottom right corner, there's a little speaker. Canvas allows the feedback, besides writing the feedback, for us to leave an audio recording for the student. So it makes it a little bit easier, sometimes faster, just to say it rather than have to type it, worry about spelling mistakes. But think about the possibilities with an adult ESOL class, where your students now hear the teacher's voice, the intonation, the excitement they have, and we're also developing their listening skill of, okay, what did the teacher say I needed to do? What do I need to focus on? So they're going to focus, and they can play it again, but it forces their ear to develop a little bit more. So just a great way of giving that kudo, making it personal on a student's level, but really giving them that purposeful feedback that our students are hungry for and actionable, where they know exactly what they can do differently as they continue to use their language or work on their math or prepare for their reading test. Finally, and I guess I was going a little fast, but finally I have one more example, and this final example is very much low tech, as a very low tech rubric. This is used by one of our IET instructors, where she focuses on, she's in this particular case, some basic employability skills that are critical in the CTE world that our instructors working on addressing with the students. Here you can see that the rubric is really just addressing some really basic attendance, professionalism, communication, participation aspects. Meets criteria, the rubric's very basic, meets the criteria, meets many but not all, meets few. And this is a type of, in this particular rubric, she's filling it out and completing it while with the student. So the student knows exactly what the criteria is. They're using the same rubric on a weekly basis because they're looking at improving this. And then the instructor goes, because the great piece of this rubric is really the conversation that comes of it with that student, where in this, and you can see it here, instructor's comment, thank you so much for being a leader in getting to know getting your team organized. So there's that positive feedback, that first bun. What an awesome job of clearly explaining to the whole class the project goal. Here comes the meat. Next week, please try to be on time and stay for the entire duration of the class. That's that key piece, the takeaway that we need to help that student improve upon. Finally, she wraps it up at the very bottom. You'll see it there with the comment as, my goal for you is to arrive on time each class period and continue, there's that positive piece, continue to be an amazing leader. Really, the main objective here is helping our students recognize the skills or the habits or the behaviors or the language that they need to refine and improve, and to be cognizant of that. And while the teacher's reviewing this on a weekly basis and working on this rubric, it doesn't mean that this is the only rubric she's going to be using. Once her class and the majority of her students have mastered these skills, she might put it aside and bring in a new set of objectives, a new set of elements that she wants to elevate them to that are more specific, more timely, more appropriate now that we've gotten these basic pieces accomplished. Very simplistic, very basic, but very powerful tools. I've been going a little bit quick. I'm not seeing a lot of comments or questions at the end, but hopefully this has created a kind of a springboard to elevate your next lessons and activities. As you provide your students with feedback that they're looking for. I guess at this point, I'll pass it back on to Tammy for some closing comments.
Thank you, Ariel. Right now, your feedback is feedback, is very important to us. You will now see 3 short questions that will now appear on your screen. Please take a moment to answer them. While you're finishing that, I want to remind you that next week's webinar is scheduled for February 9th, titled How to Make Data Work for You. This is a 2-part series that will focus on processes of using good data to improve instructions. Until then, stay safe and take care. We appreciate you.